The gavel slammed down with thunderous finality as Judge Harrison Crawford delivered his verdict: 15 years in state prison for aggravated assault. David Washington sat motionless at what he thought was the defendant's table, his expensive tailored suit doing nothing to shield him from the judge's contemptuous glare. The packed courtroom held its breath as David slowly reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather badge holder, flipping it open to reveal the golden shield of the district attorney's office. "Your Honor," David said with quiet dignity, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my role in these proceedings." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
David Washington had never been the type of man to court attention, but attention found him nonetheless on this humid Tuesday morning in Riverside County, Georgia. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from earning every achievement through merit and determination. His corner office on the 7th floor of the Riverside County Government Center offered a panoramic view of the sprawling metropolitan area he had sworn to serve. But David rarely paused to admire the scenery. The walls of his office told the story of a career built on principle and perseverance. His law degree from Yale hung beside commendations from the Georgia State Bar Association, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and 3 consecutive Governor's Awards for excellence in public service. A photograph of his father, Thomas Washington, occupied a place of honor on his desk. The same man who had worked double shifts at the Ford plant to pay for David's education, never living to see his son become the youngest district attorney in county history. David's appointment to the position 18 months earlier had marked a watershed moment for Riverside County. The region had struggled with a complicated racial history, its antebellum mansions and modern shopping centers existing side by side as reminders of both progress and the shadows of the past. His predecessor, a well-meaning but ineffective administrator named Robert Mills, had left behind a reputation for plea bargaining serious crimes and maintaining cozy relationships with defense attorneys at the expense of justice. From his first day in office, David had implemented sweeping changes to the prosecutor's office culture. He established victim advocacy programs, created specialized units for domestic violence and white-collar crime, and instituted a policy requiring all assistant district attorneys to participate in community outreach programs. His conviction rate had improved dramatically while maintaining the highest ethical standards, earning respect from law enforcement agencies throughout the state. The morning routine that would change everything began like any other. David arrived at his office at 6:30, a habit he had maintained since his days as a junior prosecutor. He reviewed case files while drinking coffee from a mug his wife Rebecca had given him for their 10th wedding anniversary, emblazoned with the words, "World's Most Dedicated DA." The irony of that inscription would become apparent before the day ended. Rebecca Washington worked as a pediatric surgeon at Riverside General Hospital, her demanding schedule often complementing David's long hours at the courthouse. Their 16-year-old daughter, Jasmine, had inherited both parents' drive and intellect, maintaining a perfect GPA while serving as president of her high school's mock trial team. The family had found their rhythm in Riverside County after relocating from Atlanta, where David had served as a senior prosecutor in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. Their decision to move to Riverside County had been motivated partly by David's desire to make a broader impact as the chief prosecutor, but also by Rebecca's opportunity to head the pediatric surgery department at the region's premier medical facility. The transition had been smooth professionally, though socially the family had encountered the subtle barriers that often exist in smaller communities unaccustomed to diversity in leadership positions. David's assistant, Patricia Stevens, knocked on his office door at 7:15 with updates on the morning's court calendar. Patricia had worked in the district attorney's office for 12 years, serving under 3 different administrators. She had initially been skeptical of David's appointment, privately questioning whether an outsider could understand the nuances of local legal culture. However, his consistent professionalism and genuine respect for staff at every level had won her loyalty completely. "Mr. Washington, you have the Henderson trial at 9 o'clock, The budget meeting with county commissioners at 11 and the afternoon staff meeting at 3, Patricia reported, consulting her tablet. Judge Crawford requested a brief conference before the Henderson trial begins. He wants to discuss jury instructions. David nodded while reviewing the Henderson case file. The matter involved a convenience store robbery where the defendant, Michael Henderson, had been caught on surveillance video threatening the elderly store owner with what appeared to be a firearm. The case seemed straightforward, with clear evidence and reliable witnesses. David had assigned it to himself to demonstrate his commitment to handling serious cases personally, rather than delegating everything to subordinates. Judge Harrison Crawford presided over Riverside County's Superior Court with an iron fist wrapped in a veneer of legal propriety. At 61 years old, Crawford had occupied the bench for nearly 2 decades, building a reputation for harsh sentences and courtroom dramatics that played well with the conservative voter base that consistently returned him to office. His grandfather had been a circuit judge during the Jim Crow era, and many observers noted uncomfortable similarities in their judicial philosophies. Crawford's courtroom reflected his personality: imposing dark wood paneling, ceremonial flags, and an elevated bench that literally looked down on everyone present. He maintained strict protocols about courtroom behavior and had held more attorneys in contempt than any other judge in the county's history. Defense lawyers often requested changes of venue when facing Crawford's court, knowing their clients faced an uphill battle regardless of the evidence.
The Henderson case had been assigned to Crawford's docket through the standard rotation system, though David suspected the judge might have requested the assignment. Crawford had made pointed comments during previous proceedings about the need for aggressive prosecution of violent crimes, often directing his remarks toward David with barely concealed hostility. The tension between them had been building since David's appointment, manifesting in procedural challenges and deliberate scheduling conflicts. David left his office at 8:30, walking the familiar route through the government complex to the courthouse building. The morning air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms from the landscaped courtyard, a pleasant contrast to the serious nature of his work. He exchanged greetings with various colleagues and courthouse staff, maintaining the professional relationships that help the justice system function smoothly. The courthouse lobby buzzed with typical morning activity: attorneys consulting with clients, witnesses reviewing testimony, and families nervously awaiting proceedings that would affect their futures. David noted the diverse crowd, reflecting Riverside County's changing demographics over the past decade. The area had attracted families seeking affordable housing and job opportunities, creating a more complex social fabric than the homogeneous community of previous generations. Security personnel at the courthouse entrance had known David for months, but still followed standard protocols for screening all visitors. Officer Janet Morrison, a 20-year veteran of courthouse security, chatted with David about her son's college graduation while processing his identification. The normalcy of these interactions would later seem surreal given the morning's developments. David proceeded to the 3rd floor, where Crawford's courtroom was located, his leather briefcase containing carefully organized files for the Henderson prosecution. He had reviewed the evidence thoroughly, prepared witness questions, and researched relevant case law to ensure a comprehensive presentation. His thoroughness had become legendary among courthouse staff, who often observed him working late into the evening preparing for trials. The courthouse hallways displayed portraits of previous judges and elected officials, a gallery that represented decades of legal tradition in Riverside County. David sometimes studied these faces, wondering what challenges they had faced and what legacy they had left behind. He hoped his own tenure would be remembered for advancing justice and equality, though he understood that meaningful change often required patience and persistence. Outside Crawford's courtroom, David encountered Detective Raymond Foster, the investigating officer in the Henderson case. Foster had worked with David on numerous prosecutions and respected his attention to detail and commitment to thorough investigation. Their professional relationship exemplified the cooperation necessary between law enforcement and prosecutors to achieve successful outcomes. The defendant, Michael Henderson, sat with his court-appointed attorney, Lisa Chen, reviewing final preparations before trial. Henderson appeared nervous but maintained his composure,
understanding that his future hung in the balance. Chen had a reputation as a competent public defender who fought hard for her clients despite limited resources. David respected her advocacy while remaining focused on his obligation to seek justice for the victims of crime. As David prepared to enter the courtroom for what he assumed would be a routine prosecution, he remained unaware that the next several hours would test everything he believed about justice, equality, and the American legal system. The case that seemed so straightforward would become a catalyst for examining deeper issues within the courthouse walls and the community beyond. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, illuminating the marble floors where countless people had walked seeking justice over the decades. David Washington was about to discover that seeking justice and receiving it were not always the same thing, especially when the system itself became the obstacle to overcome. David entered courtroom 3A at precisely 8:50, his practiced eye scanning the room for any unusual circumstances. The space felt different this morning, charged with a tension he couldn't immediately identify. The gallery held more spectators than typical for a simple robbery case, including several faces he didn't recognize mixed among the usual courthouse regulars and Henderson family members. Judge Crawford sat behind his imposing bench, reviewing documents with deliberate slowness. His bailiff, Sergeant William Torres, stood at attention near the side entrance, his expression more rigid than usual. The court reporter, Margaret Ellis, tested her equipment with mechanical precision while avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Something felt orchestrated about the scene, though David couldn't pinpoint exactly what troubled him. Defense attorney Lisa Chen occupied her usual position at the designated table, but her client, Michael Henderson, was nowhere visible. David approached his own table, setting down his briefcase and removing the Henderson file. The absence of the defendant struck him as unusual, since Crawford typically insisted on strict punctuality from all parties. "Counselor Washington," Judge Crawford called out without looking up at his papers, "please take your seat in the gallery while we wait for all parties to arrive." David paused, confused by the instruction. "Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed with opening statements. The prosecution is prepared to present its case against Mr. Henderson." Crawford finally raised his eyes, fixing David with a cold stare that seemed to look through him rather than at him. "You'll wait in the gallery until called as instructed. We have preliminary matters to address first." The dismissive tone carried an undertone David hadn't heard before in their previous interactions. He glanced toward Lisa Chen, who appeared equally puzzled by the unusual procedure. Crawford had never required prosecutors to wait in the gallery during his 20 years on the bench, and David sensed this deviation from normal protocol was directed specifically at him.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Reluctantly, David moved to an empty seat in the front row of the gallery, his briefcase balanced on his lap. He noticed several spectators studying him with curious expressions, as if they were witnessing something significant. An elderly white woman in the second row whispered to her companion while pointing in David's direction. Their conversation ceased abruptly when David made eye contact. At 9:15, a commotion arose near the courtroom entrance as Michael Henderson arrived in handcuffs, escorted by two deputy sheriffs. The 24-year-old defendant looked nervous but alert, his orange jumpsuit contrasting sharply with the formal attire of everyone else present. Henderson scanned the courtroom until his gaze settled on David, then whispered urgently to one of his escorts. Deputy Sheriff Frank Coleman approached Judge Crawford's bench for a brief, hushed conference. David strained to hear their conversation, but caught only fragments, procedural irregularity, and security protocols. Coleman nodded repeatedly at whatever instructions Crawford provided, then returned to position Henderson at what David assumed was the defendant's table. "Your Honor," Lisa Chen interjected, standing at her table. "Could we clarify the seating arrangements? I need to confer with my client before proceedings begin." Judge Crawford waved dismissively. All parties will remain in their assigned positions until this court determines proper placement. We have reports of potential disruptions requiring enhanced security measures. David felt his pulse quicken as the implications became clear. Crawford was treating him as a potential security threat rather than the chief prosecutor. The realization struck him with crystalline clarity. Someone had deliberately provided misinformation about his role in today's proceedings. But who would benefit from such deception, and what purpose did it serve? The gallery continued filling with additional spectators, many carrying notebooks or recording devices despite courthouse policies restricting such equipment. David recognized several local reporters, though their presence seemed excessive for a routine robbery trial. One journalist, Amanda Foster from the Riverside Tribune, kept glancing between David and her notepad with obvious confusion. Assistant District Attorney Ronald Blake entered the courtroom at 9:25, looking harried and unprepared. Blake had worked under David for 8 months, handling primarily misdemeanor cases and basic felony prosecutions. His presence puzzled David, since the Henderson case hadn't been assigned to Blake and required no backup prosecutor given its straightforward nature. "Mr. Blake," Judge Crawford addressed the newcomer with noticeable warmth, "please approach the bench for preliminary instructions." David watched Blake walk hesitantly toward Crawford, carrying a thin file that clearly contained minimal preparation materials. Their whispered conference lasted several minutes, with Blake occasionally glancing back toward David with growing bewilderment. Whatever Crawford was telling him obviously contradicted Blake's understanding of the day's agenda. During this delay, David noticed courthouse clerk Sandra Peterson distributing papers to various court personnel. Peterson had served in her position for 15 years and maintained professional relationships with all the attorneys practicing in Crawford's court. However, she avoided making eye contact with David despite their previous friendly interactions. The tension in the courtroom escalated when County Sheriff Marcus Rodriguez entered with 3 additional deputies, positioning themselves strategically around the room. Rodriguez had worked closely with David on numerous prosecutions and had publicly praised the district attorney's office under David's leadership. Yet today, Rodriguez treated David like any other civilian observer, rather than acknowledging their professional relationship. "Mr. Blake returned from his conference with Crawford looking increasingly uncomfortable. He approached David's position in the gallery, speaking in hushed tones to avoid disturbing the proceedings. "Mr. Washington, I need to ask you some questions about your involvement in this case. Judge Crawford has indicated there might be irregularities in the case assignment." David studied Blake's expression, recognizing genuine confusion rather than deliberate deception. Someone had fed Blake incomplete or false information about the day's proceedings. "Who told you to question my involvement?" David asked quietly. "I assigned this case to myself personally and filed all proper documentation with the clerk's office." Blake glanced nervously toward Crawford, who was monitoring their conversation with obvious disapproval. "I received a call this morning from someone claiming to represent the state attorney general's office. They suggested there might be improper case handling requiring investigation." The pieces began forming a disturbing pattern in David's mind. Someone with access to court scheduling and personnel information had orchestrated this confusion, specifically targeting his role in the Henderson prosecution. The timing seemed calculated to embarrass him publicly while undermining his authority as district attorney. "Mr. Blake," Judge Crawford called impatiently, "please proceed with your opening statement so we can move forward with this trial." David watched Blake approach the prosecution table with visible reluctance. Blake had never tried a felony case independently and lacked the preparation necessary for effective prosecution. The Henderson case required careful presentation of evidence and coordinated witness testimony that Blake simply couldn't provide on short notice. "Your Honor," Blake began uncertainly, "the prosecution requests a brief recess to review case materials and clarify procedural questions." Crawford's face darkened with theatrical anger. "Counselor, this court will not tolerate delays due to prosecutorial incompetence. Either proceed immediately or face sanctions for wasting court time." The harsh rebuke seemed designed to humiliate Blake while indirectly attacking David's administration of the district attorney's office.
Crawford had never shown such hostility toward prosecutors in David's previous observations, suggesting this performance was crafted specifically for today's audience. Lisa Chen rose from her position, sensing an opportunity created by the prosecution's obvious confusion. Your Honor, given the apparent disorganization in the prosecution office, the defense moves for dismissal of all charges against Mr. Henderson. David felt compelled to intervene despite his awkward position in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may address the court regarding these procedural issues. Crawford's gavel slammed down with excessive force. You will remain silent unless specifically addressed by this court. Any further interruptions will result in removal from the courtroom. The threat carried unmistakable menace, and David realized Crawford was prepared to escalate the confrontation if challenged. The judge's behavior violated numerous standards of judicial conduct, but David understood that protesting would likely result in his ejection from proceedings he was supposed to be leading. Meanwhile, Henderson continued studying David with obvious confusion, occasionally leaning toward his escort deputies to ask whispered questions. The defendant clearly recognized something was wrong with the courtroom dynamics, but couldn't understand the source of the problem. Amanda Foster, the Tribune reporter, had begun taking detailed notes about the unusual proceedings. Her journalistic instincts obviously detected the story developing beyond a simple robbery trial. Other reporters followed her lead, documenting the unprecedented sight of a district attorney being treated as a spectator in his own prosecution.
Blake attempted to present opening arguments with materials he'd never seen before, stumbling through basic factual recitations while occasionally glancing toward David for guidance. Crawford allowed this incompetent performance to continue, seemingly enjoying Blake's obvious discomfort and the resulting reflection on David's office.
The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly surreal as normal legal procedures gave way to Crawford's orchestrated theater. Court personnel who typically maintained professional demeanor appeared nervous and uncertain, suggesting they weren't fully aware of whatever plan was unfolding. David recognized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his legal career, a deliberate attempt to undermine his authority and credibility through judicial manipulation. The question remained whether this represented isolated hostility from Crawford or part of a broader conspiracy involving multiple participants. As Blake concluded his disjointed opening statement, David noticed several spectators in the gallery exchanging satisfied glances, as if witnessing expected developments. These individuals hadn't attended previous trials in Crawford's court, suggesting their presence was specifically related to today's events. The morning that had begun with routine expectations had transformed into a carefully orchestrated challenge to everything David had built during his tenure as district attorney. The real trial, he realized, wasn't about Michael Henderson's alleged robbery. It was about David's right to serve as the chief prosecutor in Riverside County. The Henderson trial devolved into chaos as Blake struggled through witness examinations he hadn't prepared for. David watched from the gallery as the convenience store owner, elderly Vietnamese immigrant Gain Patel, testified about the robbery with Blake fumbling basic questions about timeline and evidence. Patel kept glancing toward David with obvious confusion, having met with him personally during case preparation just 2 days earlier. Judge Crawford interrupted the testimony repeatedly, sustaining defense objections that would normally be overruled and creating procedural hurdles that sabotaged Blake's already weak presentation. When Blake attempted to introduce security footage clearly showing Henderson threatening Patel with what appeared to be a weapon, Crawford ruled the evidence inadmissible due to improper foundation. "Counselor Blake," Crawford announced with theatrical exasperation, "your incompetence is wasting this court's valuable time. Perhaps the district attorney's office needs better training in basic trial procedures." The pointed reference to David's administration drew murmurs from the gallery and knowing smiles from several spectators who seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. David recognized the coordinated nature of their reactions, suggesting these weren't random courthouse observers, but individuals specifically present to witness his humiliation. During the lunch recess, David attempted to reach his office from the courthouse lobby, only to discover his keycard access had been deactivated. The security system that normally recognized his credentials now treated him as an unauthorized visitor. Building maintenance supervisor James Mitchell, who had greeted David warmly every morning for 18 months, now avoided eye contact while explaining that all access cards were being updated for security purposes. "Mr. Washington," a voice called from behind him. David turned to find County Commissioner Angela Rodriguez approaching with obvious concern. She had worked closely with David on criminal justice reform initiatives and had publicly supported his appointment as district attorney. "What's happening with the Henderson trial? I'm getting calls from reporters asking why you're not prosecuting the case." "Someone has systematically undermined my authority," David replied, choosing his words carefully in the public setting. "I suspect this goes beyond simple judicial hostility." Angela glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "There was a closed-door meeting yesterday between Judge Crawford and several county officials. I wasn't invited, but I heard Mayor Preston and Police Chief Williams were involved. They discussed concerns about your leadership style and its impact on community relations." The revelation confirmed David's suspicions about organized opposition. Mayor Richard Preston had been lukewarm about David's appointment from the beginning, preferring a candidate who had maintained the status quo rather than implementing the aggressive reforms David had championed. Police Chief Samuel Williams had publicly supported David, but privately expressed concerns about prosecutorial policies that required more thorough investigations. David attempted to return to his office through the government center's main entrance, but found additional obstacles waiting. Security guard Robert Martinez, normally friendly and professional, now insisted on following strict visitor protocols that required David to surrender his identification and submit to a comprehensive background check despite having worked in the building for over a year. "I'm sorry, Mr. Washington," Martinez explained apologetically. "New regulations require enhanced screening for all personnel. There have been concerns raised about security protocols." The systematic nature of these obstacles revealed careful planning and coordination among multiple departments. Someone with significant authority had issued instructions designed to isolate David from his normal support systems and professional resources. The timing, coinciding with the Henderson trial, suggested the goal was maximum public embarrassment. Inside his office building, David discovered additional problems. His assistant, Patricia Stevens, was absent, replaced by a temporary worker named Carol Thompson, who claimed to have no knowledge of David's schedule or pending cases. Thompson explained that Patricia had been reassigned to special projects indefinitely, effective immediately. David's computer access had also been restricted, preventing him from reviewing case files or accessing the prosecution database. When he called the IT department, technician Mike Foster explained that system maintenance required temporary password resets for security purposes. The new passwords would be available within 72 hours, pending administrative approval. These technical difficulties effectively severed David from the information systems necessary to perform his duties as district attorney. Without access to case files, witness information, or scheduling systems, he couldn't effectively manage ongoing prosecutions or prepare for upcoming trials. The afternoon session of the Henderson trial brought fresh humiliations as Blake called Detective Raymond Foster to testify about the investigation. Foster had worked closely with David on dozens of cases and respected his thorough approach to evidence evaluation. However, Crawford's hostile questioning made Foster appear incompetent, while suggesting the prosecution's office had mishandled the investigation. "Detective Foster," Crawford interjected during direct examination, "are you confident that the prosecution has properly prepared for this trial? Have you noticed any irregularities in case management under the current administration?" The loaded questions violated judicial ethics by asking the witness to comment on prosecutorial competence rather than factual evidence. Foster looked uncomfortable, but answered diplomatically that he had always found the district attorney's office professional and thorough in their case preparation. Crawford's expression darkened at this response. "I see. And would you characterize today's prosecution presentation as professional and thorough?" Foster glanced toward David in the gallery before responding carefully that he couldn't comment on courtroom procedures outside his expertise as an investigating officer. The diplomatic answer avoided directly criticizing Blake while refusing to validate Crawford's attack on David's administration. During Blake's continued struggles with evidence presentation, David noticed several individuals in the gallery taking detailed notes and photographs, despite courthouse restrictions on recording devices. Court security, normally vigilant about such violations, seemed to be deliberately ignoring these activities. One photographer, later identified as freelance journalist Marcus Thompson, captured images of David sitting in the gallery looking frustrated and isolated. These photos would later appear in news articles describing dysfunction within the district attorney's office and questions about David's leadership capabilities. The systematic media coordination became apparent when David's phone began receiving calls from reporters asking for comment on allegations of prosecutorial misconduct and suggestions that he was unfit for his position. The questions revealed detailed knowledge of internal office operations that could only have come from sources with intimate access to confidential information.
Channel 7 News reporter Jennifer Walsh approached David outside the courthouse with cameras rolling, asking pointed questions designed to create negative sound bites. "Mr. Washington, how do you respond to concerns that your office is unprepared for major prosecutions? Do you plan to resign following today's courtroom difficulties?" David declined to comment on ongoing proceedings, but recognized the orchestrated nature of the media attention. Someone had provided reporters with specific talking points and background information designed to portray him as incompetent and overwhelmed by his responsibilities. The evening brought additional challenges when David arrived home to find his personal security system had been triggered by unknown individuals attempting to access his property. Police responded to the alarm but found no evidence of forced entry, though neighbors reported seeing unmarked vehicles parked near his house throughout the day. Rebecca confronted him at the door with obvious concern and anger. "David, what's happening? I received calls at the hospital asking about your mental health and fitness for duty. Someone contacted the medical staff claiming you were experiencing a breakdown." The personal attacks on his family marked a dangerous escalation in the opposition campaign. Targeting Rebecca's professional reputation and suggesting David was mentally unstable represented a coordinated effort to destroy his credibility both professionally and personally. Their daughter Jasmine emerged from a room looking shaken. "Dad, someone posted things about you online claiming you're corrupt and incompetent. My friends are asking if it's true. The social media campaign has already started affecting our family." David realized the opposition had moved beyond judicial manipulation to include comprehensive attacks on his reputation, family stability, and professional relationships. The scope of the conspiracy suggested involvement from multiple powerful individuals with access to government resources and media connections. That evening, David attempted to contact allies within the legal community but discovered many were suddenly unavailable or unwilling to discuss the situation. Defense attorney Maria Santos, who had always maintained cordial professional relationships with David, claimed she was too busy to meet despite their previous friendship. The isolation campaign was succeeding in cutting David off from the support networks necessary to investigate and counter the attacks against him. By systematically turning colleagues against him or intimidating them into silence, the opposition was creating the impression that David lacked professional credibility and community support. Late that night, David's home phone received anonymous calls with threatening messages, suggesting he should resign immediately for his family's safety. The callers demonstrated detailed knowledge of Jasmine's school schedule and Rebecca's hospital assignments, indicating sophisticated surveillance of his personal life. The escalation from professional sabotage to personal threats marked a turning point in the campaign against David. The opposition was prepared to target his family directly to achieve their goal of removing him from office. The stakes had risen beyond professional embarrassment to include genuine concerns for his loved one's safety and well-being. As David prepared for what promised to be an even more challenging second day of the Henderson trial, he understood that he was facing something far more dangerous than simple judicial hostility or political disagreement. The systematic nature of the attack suggested a conspiracy involving multiple powerful individuals determined to destroy his career and reputation by any means necessary. The second day of the Henderson trial began with David arriving at the courthouse to find protesters assembled outside, carrying signs demanding his resignation. The demonstration appeared professionally organized, with matching banners reading "Clean House at DA's office" and "Accountability Now." Local television crews filmed the spectacle while reporters interviewed protesters who made surprisingly detailed accusations about David's alleged incompetence and corruption. Protest organizer Helen Caldwell, later revealed to be Judge Crawford's sister-in-law, spoke passionately to Channel 12 News about the need for new leadership in the prosecutor's office. "The citizens of Riverside County deserve better than the chaos we witnessed yesterday," she declared. "When a district attorney can't even properly prosecute a simple robbery case, it's time for change." David recognized the sophisticated coordination behind the demonstration. The protesters knew specific details about yesterday's courtroom proceedings that hadn't been reported in morning news coverage, suggesting they had received insider information about the trial's orchestrated disruptions. Their talking points aligned perfectly with the media narrative being constructed around his alleged failures. Inside the courthouse, David discovered that his situation had deteriorated overnight. Security personnel now escorted him through a separate entrance, typically reserved for defendants in high-profile cases. Officer Patricia Williams, who had previously treated David with professional courtesy, now maintained the cold demeanor reserved for individuals considered security risks. The courtroom atmosphere had grown even more hostile, with additional spectators filling every available seat. David noticed several individuals he recognized as prominent community leaders, including Chamber of Commerce President Donald Hayes and Real Estate Developer Association Chairman Robert Sterling. Their presence suggested the opposition campaign had expanded beyond courthouse politics to include broader business community pressure. Judge Crawford entered the courtroom with obvious satisfaction, surveying the packed gallery before fixing his gaze on David in what had been his assigned seating area. The judge's demeanor projected supreme confidence, as if he knew the day's events would unfold according to his predetermined script. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Crawford," Bailiff Torres announced with unusual formality, emphasizing Crawford's title in a way that seemed designed to highlight David's reduced status as mere spectator. ADA Blake approached the prosecution table looking even more haggard than the previous day. His trembling hands revealed the stress of attempting to handle a case he was completely unprepared for, while being observed by hostile courthouse personnel and an increasingly aggressive defense team. "Your Honor," Blake began nervously, "the prosecution requests a continuance to properly prepare our case presentation, given the complexity of the evidence and witness coordination requirements." "Request denied," Crawford interrupted sharply. "This court will not accommodate prosecutorial incompetence. Either proceed immediately or face sanctions for deliberate delay tactics." The harsh ruling drew approving nods from several spectators who seemed pleased by Crawford's treatment of the prosecution. Their synchronized reactions reinforced David's growing certainty that today's proceedings were being orchestrated for their benefit. Defense attorney Lisa Chen rose with renewed confidence, sensing the prosecution's weakness and judicial bias working in her favor. "Your Honor, given the state's obvious inability to present a coherent case, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Henderson." Crawford pretended to consider the motion while making a show of reviewing case documents. The evidence presented yesterday was indeed insufficient to meet basic prosecutorial standards. However, I'll allow the state one final opportunity to salvage their case before ruling on dismissal. David felt compelled to intervene, despite the risks involved. "Your Honor, if I may address the court regarding prosecutorial preparation and case management." "You will remain silent," Crawford thundered, slamming his gavel with excessive force. Any further disruptions will result in immediate removal and contempt charges. This court will not tolerate interference from unauthorized individuals." The threat carried unmistakable menace, and David understood that Crawford was prepared to escalate their confrontation to include criminal charges. The contempt citation would provide legal justification for David's arrest and detention, further undermining his credibility and effectiveness as district attorney. Blake's attempted examination of the arresting officer, Detective Foster, became a disaster as Crawford sustained every defense objection while overruling the prosecution's legitimate requests for clarification. The judge's bias had become so blatant that even experienced court personnel appeared uncomfortable with the proceedings.
"Detective Foster," Crawford interjected during Blake's direct examination, "do you have confidence in the prosecution's handling of this investigation? Have you observed competent case management from the current district attorney's office?" The inappropriate questions violated judicial ethics by asking the witness to evaluate prosecutorial performance rather than testifying about factual evidence. Foster looked increasingly uncomfortable as Crawford pressed him to criticize David's administration. "Your Honor," Chen objected with obvious reluctance, "those questions call for speculation beyond the witness's expertise." "Objection overruled," Crawford snapped. "The witness will answer regarding his professional observations of prosecutorial competence." Foster glanced toward David before responding carefully that he had always found the district attorney's office thorough and professional in their case preparation and investigation coordination. Crawford's face darkened at this response. "Detective, are you suggesting that yesterday's courtroom performance represents thorough and professional prosecution?" The loaded question put Foster in an impossible position, forcing him to either criticize Blake's obviously inadequate preparation or contradict the judge's assessment. Foster chose diplomatic silence rather than participating in Crawford's orchestrated attack on David's administration. During the lunch recess, David attempted to contact County Attorney General Patricia Morrison for guidance, only to discover that someone had already reached her with allegations about his conduct. Morrison's secretary explained that the Attorney General was reviewing complaints about David's fitness for office and couldn't discuss pending investigations. The speed and coordination of these complaints revealed the opposition's sophisticated planning and connections. Someone with significant political influence had activated multiple oversight mechanisms simultaneously, creating the appearance of widespread concern about David's performance while preventing him from accessing normal support channels. David's attempts to reach Governor Thomas Bradley's office met similar obstacles. Chief of Staff Michael Thompson claimed the governor was too busy to discuss local prosecutorial matters, despite David's appointment requiring gubernatorial approval and their previous positive relationship. The isolation campaign had succeeded in cutting David off from the political allies necessary to counter the coordinated attacks against him. By activating complaint procedures and suggesting investigations were already underway, the opposition had made it politically dangerous for officials to associate with David publicly. Returning to the courthouse, David discovered additional humiliations waiting. His parking privileges had been revoked, forcing him to search for public parking while court personnel and media observers watched his obvious displacement from normal courthouse access. The afternoon session brought fresh disasters as Blake attempted to present physical evidence linking Henderson to the robbery. Crawford ruled each piece of evidence inadmissible due to procedural technicalities that wouldn't normally apply, systematically dismantling the prosecution's case while creating grounds for dismissal. When Blake offered security footage clearly showing Henderson threatening Patel with what appeared to be a weapon, Crawford sustained Chen's objection regarding authentication despite the evidence meeting standard admissibility requirements. "Counselor Blake," Crawford announced with theatrical frustration, "your continued incompetence is wasting this court's time and taxpayer resources. Perhaps the district attorney's office requires immediate administrative review." The pointed reference to administrative review carried significant implications, suggesting Crawford was prepared to recommend formal investigation of David's office management.
Such recommendations from sitting judges carried significant weight with oversight agencies and could trigger damaging inquiries. David's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown local number. He hesitated before answering, expecting another threatening message or hostile interrogation from a reporter. Instead, he heard the nervous voice of courthouse janitor Ernest Williams, a 60-year-old African-American man who had worked in the building for over 30 years. "Mr. Washington," Ernest whispered urgently, "I need to speak with you privately. I've been watching what's happening, and there are things you need to know. Can you meet me at the old parking garage on 5th Street in 20 minutes?"
The request seemed unusual, but David recognized the genuine concern in Ernest's voice. As a longtime courthouse employee, Ernest had observed countless trials and legal proceedings while remaining invisible to most attorneys and judges. His perspective might provide insights unavailable through official channels. David drove to the designated meeting location, checking his mirrors for surveillance vehicles that might be following him. The parking garage appeared empty, except for Ernest's weathered pickup truck parked on the 3rd level. Ernest emerged from the shadows, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Washington, I've been cleaning Judge Crawford's chambers for 15 years, Ernest began, without preamble. "Last week, I found documents in his trash that I thought you should see. I know I could lose my job for this, but what's happening to you isn't right." Ernest handed David a manila envelope containing shredded papers he had carefully reassembled with tape. The documents revealed communications between Crawford and several county officials discussing strategies to discredit David's administration and force his resignation. The first document was a typed memo from Mayor Preston to Crawford outlining concerns about David's aggressive prosecution policies affecting local business interests. The memo specifically mentioned real estate developer Robert Sterling's frustration with David's corruption investigations targeting zoning board irregularities. A second document contained handwritten notes in Crawford's distinctive script detailing plans to orchestrate courtroom disruptions that would make David appear incompetent. The notes included specific instructions about restricting David's access to courthouse facilities and coordinating media coverage of his alleged failures. The most damaging evidence was a series of email printouts showing coordination between Crawford, Police Chief Williams, and County Commissioner Hayes regarding the timing of the Henderson trial to coincide with David's planned humiliation. The emails revealed that Henderson's case had been deliberately assigned to Crawford's docket specifically to provide a venue for the orchestrated attack. Ernest watched David review the documents with obvious anxiety. "There's more," he said quietly. "Yesterday morning, I overheard a phone conversation in Crawford's chambers. He was talking to someone about making sure you couldn't access your office computers or case files. He said the final phase would happen today during the Henderson sentencing." The revelation about a planned sentencing phase confused David since Henderson's charges had been dismissed. The apparent discrepancy suggested Crawford had predetermined the trial's outcome while planning additional proceedings designed to maximize David's humiliation. Ernest continued his revelations. "I also found this in Crawford's personal files." He handed David a copy of a psychological evaluation report allegedly documenting David's mental instability and unfitness for office. The report was dated 3 days earlier but described incidents and behaviors that had never occurred. The fabricated psychological evaluation represented sophisticated character assassination, providing official-looking documentation to support claims about David's incompetence. The report's existence revealed the depth of the conspiracy and the lengths to which Crawford and his allies were prepared to go. David studied the forged evaluation, recognizing several signatures from mental health professionals who had never examined him. The document's professional appearance would make it difficult to challenge without extensive investigation, providing Crawford with apparent medical justification for questioning David's fitness. "Mr. Washington," Ernest said with growing urgency, "there's something else you need to know. This morning, I overheard a phone conversation in Crawford's chambers. He was talking to someone about making sure you couldn't access your office computers or case files. He said the final phase would happen today during the Henderson sentencing." The revelation about a planned sentencing phase confused David since Henderson's charges had been dismissed. The apparent discrepancy suggested Crawford had predetermined the trial's outcome while planning additional proceedings designed to maximize David's humiliation. Ernest continued his revelations. I also found this in Crawford's personal files. He handed David a copy of a forged psychological evaluation report allegedly documenting David's mental instability and unfitness for office. The report was dated 3 days earlier but described incidents and behaviors that had never occurred. The fabricated psychological evaluation represented sophisticated character assassination, providing official-looking documentation to support claims about David's incompetence. The report's existence revealed the depth of the conspiracy and the lengths to which Crawford and his allies were prepared to go. David studied the forged evaluation, recognizing several signatures from mental health professionals who had never examined him. The document's professional appearance would make it difficult to challenge without extensive investigation, providing Crawford with apparent medical justification for questioning David's fitness. "Mr. Washington," Ernest said with growing urgency, "there's something else you need to know. This morning, I saw Crawford meeting with 2 men in expensive suits who weren't lawyers. They had briefcases and were discussing payment schedules and completion bonuses. One of them mentioned ensuring you never practiced law again." The reference to outside contractors suggested the conspiracy extended beyond local political figures to include professional operatives hired to orchestrate David's destruction. The financial incentives indicated significant resources were being invested in removing him from office. Ernest's revelations provided David with concrete evidence of the systematic campaign against him, but also highlighted the personal risks faced by anyone attempting to expose the truth. Ernest's willingness to jeopardize his employment demonstrated the moral courage necessary to challenge entrenched corruption. Armed with Ernest's evidence, David drove to the offices of the State Bureau of Investigation, hoping to find someone with authority and integrity to properly investigate the conspiracy. The SBI maintained jurisdiction over corruption cases involving local government officials and had resources unavailable to individual prosecutors. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez reviewed David's documentation with professional interest and growing concern. The evidence suggested violations of multiple federal and state laws, including conspiracy to deprive civil rights, obstruction of justice, and judicial corruption. Martinez had investigated similar cases involving coordinated efforts to undermine law enforcement officials. "Mr. Washington," Agent Martinez said after examining the documents, "this appears to be a sophisticated operation with significant financial backing. The psychological evaluation alone required access to medical databases and professional credentials. We're looking at a conspiracy involving multiple conspirators with substantial resources." Martinez explained that the SBI had been monitoring unusual activities in Riverside County following anonymous tips about judicial irregularities and corruption. David's case provided the first concrete evidence linking various suspicious incidents to a coordinated campaign. The federal investigation had already identified several financial transactions between Crawford and unknown parties that coincided with controversial rulings in high-profile cases. David's documentation filled crucial gaps in the evidence pattern while providing insight into the conspiracy's operational methods. Martinez arranged for David to provide a detailed statement while SBI technicians began analyzing the physical evidence Ernest had recovered. The reassembled documents contained fingerprints and DNA evidence that could identify additional participants in the conspiracy. Meanwhile, David's phone received a call from Tribune reporter Amanda Foster, who had been investigating irregularities in the Henderson trial. Foster had noticed the unprecedented nature of Crawford's judicial conduct and began researching similar patterns in previous cases. "Mr. Washington," Foster said with obvious excitement, "I've found something significant. Judge Crawford's sentencing patterns showed dramatic changes over the past 6 months, particularly in cases involving defendants with connections to major real estate developments. The statistical analysis suggests systematic bias beyond normal judicial variation." Foster's independent investigation had identified the same corruption patterns documented in Ernest's evidence. Her journalistic resources had uncovered financial connections between Crawford and development companies that correlated with favorable rulings in zoning and environmental cases.
The reporter's findings provided additional validation for David's claims while establishing media interest in exposing the conspiracy. Foster's willingness to investigate judicial corruption offered hope for public accountability even if criminal prosecutions proved difficult. David arranged to meet with Foster at a secure location to share Ernest's evidence while protecting the janitor's identity. Foster's professional relationships with other journalists could amplify the story beyond local media while applying pressure on officials involved in the conspiracy. The meeting with Foster revealed additional dimensions of the corruption scheme. Her investigation had identified coordination between Crawford's court and several private law firms that received favorable treatment in exchange for political and financial support. The corruption extended beyond David's case to affect numerous legal proceedings. Foster had also discovered connections between the courthouse conspiracy and broader efforts to influence county government decisions, affecting development projects worth millions of dollars. David's aggressive prosecution of corruption cases had threatened financial interests far beyond local politics. As David provided Foster with copies of Ernest's evidence, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Rebecca. Hospital security had detained an individual attempting to access her surgical schedule while claiming to be conducting official background checks. The incident confirmed that family threats were escalating to include direct surveillance and potential physical approach.
The timing of the hospital incident, coinciding with David's meeting with the FBI, suggested the conspiracy had sophisticated intelligence capabilities. Someone was monitoring his activities and responding with intimidation tactics designed to pressure him into abandoning his investigation. Agent Martinez contacted David immediately upon learning of the hospital incident. Federal agents were dispatched to provide security for Rebecca and Jasmine while the investigation continued. The conspiracy's willingness to target family members elevated the case to include potential federal charges. The SBI's rapid response demonstrated that David's evidence had triggered serious federal interest in the Riverside County corruption case. Resources that had been unavailable to him as an isolated local prosecutor were now being deployed to investigate and prosecute the conspiracy. As evening approached, David received an unexpected call from Governor Bradley's chief of staff, Michael Thompson. The governor had been briefed on the federal investigation and wanted to discuss David's situation directly. The political support that had been withdrawn was suddenly being restored as evidence of the conspiracy became undeniable. "Mr. Washington," Thompson said with obvious concern, "the governor wants you to know that your position as district attorney has his full support. We've been made aware of the coordinated efforts to undermine your administration, and state resources are being deployed to ensure your safety and the integrity of the judicial process." The governor's intervention marked a turning point in the crisis, providing David with the political backing necessary to counter his opponent's influence. State authority was being activated to protect him from further harassment while investigating those responsible for the conspiracy. The day that had begun with David's complete isolation and apparent defeat was ending with powerful allies emerging to support his fight for justice. The truth was finally beginning to emerge through the courage of individuals like Ernest Williams and the dedication of professionals like Agent Martinez and reporter Foster. The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed as SBI agents executed search warrants across Riverside County. Judge Crawford's chambers, Mayor Preston's office, and the offices of Sterling Development Corporation were simultaneously raided at dawn, with agents seizing computers, financial records, and communication devices. The coordinated operation demonstrated the serious federal interest in the corruption conspiracy. Agent Martinez briefed David on the initial findings from the searches. Crawford's personal computer contained extensive communications with Sterling Development regarding specific cases and rulings, including detailed discussions about eliminating obstacles to major development projects. The digital evidence corroborated Ernest Williams' documentary findings while revealing the full scope of the corruption network. The investigation had also uncovered a sophisticated money laundering operation through which Crawford received payments for favorable rulings. Sterling Development had created multiple shell companies that funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars to Crawford through consulting contracts and speaking fees for events that never occurred. FBI financial crime specialist Agent Thomas Rodriguez explained the payment structure to David during a briefing at the federal building. Judge Crawford received incremental payments tied to specific judicial decisions affecting Sterling's projects.
The larger the financial impact of his rulings, the greater his compensation. It's a pay-per-ruling system disguised as legitimate business relationships. The financial investigation revealed that Crawford had received over $800,000 during the previous 2 years, coinciding with rulings that approved controversial development projects while blocking environmental and zoning challenges. The systematic nature of the payments proved deliberate corruption rather than isolated incidents. Meanwhile, the fabricated psychological evaluation had been traced to a private investigation firm with connections to Sterling Development. The company specialized in creating false documentation to discredit opposition figures in business and political disputes. Their services included identity theft, document forgery, and reputation destruction campaigns. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a legitimate forensic psychologist, examined the forged evaluation and confirmed its fraudulent nature. The document contains multiple inconsistencies with standard psychological assessment protocols, she reported to federal investigators. The signatures are sophisticated forgeries, but the content reveals fundamental misunderstanding of diagnostic procedures. The exposure of the forged psychological evaluation triggered additional federal charges related to identity theft and fraud. The investigation expanded to include the private investigation firm's other clients and potential victims of similar reputation destruction campaigns. County officials began distancing themselves from Crawford and Sterling as the evidence mounted. Commissioner Hayes requested an emergency meeting with David to discuss his continued support for reform initiatives. Mayor Preston's office issued a statement praising David's integrity and dedication to justice while claiming ignorance of any corruption schemes. The political realignment happened swiftly, as elected officials recognized the federal investigation's seriousness and the potential consequences of association with the conspiracy. Those who had withdrawn support from David suddenly emphasized their commitment to ethical governance and prosecutorial independence. Police Chief Williams visited David personally to apologize for his office's participation in the harassment campaign. Chief Williams explained that he had been pressured by Mayor Preston and threatened with budget cuts if he didn't cooperate with efforts to undermine David's administration. "Mr. Washington," Chief Williams said with obvious embarrassment, "I allowed political pressure to compromise my professional judgment. My officers and I want to work with your office to rebuild the trust we damaged through our participation in this conspiracy." The police department's cooperation provided additional evidence about the coordination of harassment activities, including surveillance of David's family and manipulation of security protocols. Chief Williams offered full access to department records and personnel to support the federal investigation. David's access to courthouse facilities and computer systems was immediately restored by emergency order from the state Supreme Court. Chief Justice Eleanor Patterson personally contacted David to express the court's support for his position and commitment to investigating judicial misconduct. "Mr. Washington," Chief Justice Patterson said during their phone conversation, "the behavior alleged against Judge Crawford represents a fundamental betrayal of judicial ethics and public trust. The Supreme Court will pursue all available remedies to ensure accountability and prevent similar abuse of judicial authority." The Supreme Court's intervention included suspension of Crawford's judicial authority pending completion of the federal investigation. Special prosecutors were appointed to review all cases Crawford had handled during the previous 5 years, with particular attention to patterns of bias and corruption. Tribune reporter Amanda Foster published her comprehensive investigation of the corruption network, revealing connections between Crawford, Sterling Development, and several other business interests that had benefited from favorable judicial rulings. Her articles documented a systematic pattern of corruption affecting dozens of cases and millions of dollars in development projects. Foster's reporting included interviews with other attorneys who had observed Crawford's suspicious behavior but felt powerless to challenge a sitting judge. The articles revealed that David's experience was part of a broader pattern of intimidation and manipulation affecting the entire local legal community. The public reaction to Foster's reporting was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens demanded accountability from elected officials while expressing support for David's continued leadership as district attorney. The revelation that their justice system had been corrupted for private gain triggered widespread anger and calls for reform. Ernest Williams received protection under federal witness protection protocols as his crucial role in exposing the conspiracy became known. The SBI arranged for his family's temporary relocation while the investigation continued, recognizing that his courage had been essential to breaking the case open.
David met privately with Ernest to express his gratitude for the janitor's moral courage. "Your willingness to risk everything for the truth saved not just my career, but the integrity of our entire justice system," David told him. "History will remember your contribution to this fight for justice." Ernest's simple response reflected the moral clarity that had motivated his actions. "Mr. Washington, I've watched too many good people get destroyed by powerful folks who think they're above the law. Sometimes ordinary people have to stand up and do what's right, even when it's dangerous." The Henderson case was reopened with proper prosecutorial procedures and judicial oversight. A new judge, appointed by the state Supreme Court, reviewed the evidence and confirmed that Henderson's original charges should proceed to trial. The defendant, who had walked free due to Crawford's manipulation, now faced justice under legitimate legal proceedings. David personally prosecuted the renewed Henderson case, demonstrating the competent and ethical legal work that had been sabotaged during Crawford's orchestrated disruption. The trial proceeded smoothly with proper evidence presentation and fair judicial procedures, resulting in Henderson's conviction on all charges. The successful Henderson prosecution vindicated David's reputation, while illustrating the dramatic difference between legitimate legal proceedings and the corrupted process Crawford had orchestrated. Justice for the convenience store owner and community was finally achieved through proper legal channels. Sterling Development Corporation faced federal charges for their role in the bribery and corruption conspiracy. The company's assets were frozen pending investigation of their business practices and compliance with federal regulations. Several major development projects were suspended while authorities reviewed the circumstances of their approval. Robert Sterling himself was arrested on multiple federal charges, including bribery, conspiracy, and racketeering. His empire of development projects built on corruption and political manipulation began crumbling as authorities scrutinized every aspect of his business operations. Judge Crawford was formally charged with 18 federal counts, including bribery, conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and judicial corruption. His arrest in front of the courthouse where he had once wielded absolute authority provided symbolic closure for his victims and the community he had betrayed. The psychological impact on Crawford was evident during his perp walk, as cameras captured his transformation from imperious judge to handcuffed defendant. The man who had threatened David with contempt and imprisonment now faced the possibility of decades in federal prison for his own criminal conduct. Mayor Preston and several county commissioners faced federal charges for their participation in the conspiracy. The investigation revealed that the corruption network extended throughout local government, affecting zoning decisions, contract awards, and regulatory enforcement that had benefited Sterling's business interests. David's vindication was complete when the State Bar Association issued a formal apology for the harassment he had endured and commended his integrity in the face of systematic persecution. The organization announced new protocols for protecting prosecutors and other legal professionals from judicial intimidation and political retaliation. The governor visited Riverside County personally to present David with the state's highest honor for public service, recognizing his courage in exposing corruption and maintaining ethical standards despite extreme pressure. The ceremony took place in the same courthouse where Crawford had attempted to destroy David's career and reputation. During his acceptance speech, David reflected on the broader implications of the case for justice and democracy. When those entrusted with upholding the law instead subvert it for personal gain, ordinary citizens suffer the consequences, he told the assembled crowd. This case reminds us that eternal vigilance is the price of justice. The resolution of the conspiracy marked not just personal vindication for David, but institutional reform that would protect future prosecutors and defendants from similar abuse. The courage of individuals like Ernest Williams and the dedication of professionals like Agent Martinez had preserved the integrity of the justice system when it faced its greatest challenge. 2 years after the corruption trials that transformed Riverside County, David Washington stood before the newly constructed Justice Memorial in the Courthouse Plaza. The bronze sculpture honored individuals who had fought against corruption in the legal system, with Ernest Williams' name prominently displayed alongside other courage champions who had risked everything to preserve justice. The memorial dedication drew visitors from across the state, including law students, civil rights leaders, and government officials studying the institutional reforms that had emerged from the Crawford conspiracy case. David's experience had become a touchstone for discussions about judicial accountability and prosecutorial independence. Rebecca and Jasmine flanked David during the ceremony, their presence symbolizing the family's strength that had sustained him through the darkest period of his career. Jasmine, now 18 and preparing for college, had chosen to study criminal justice after witnessing her father's fight against systemic corruption. "Dad," Jasmine said as they walked through the memorial garden, "my professor asked me to write about how the case changed our family. I told her it taught me that standing up for what's right sometimes means standing alone, but the truth eventually finds allies." The educational impact of David's case had spread throughout law schools and police academies. The Crawford conspiracy had become required study material for courses on legal ethics, demonstrating how corruption could infiltrate even the most fundamental institutions of justice. Professor Maria Santos at the State University Law School regularly used David's case in her judicial ethics seminars. Students examined the step-by-step breakdown of institutional safeguards and the individual choices that either enabled or prevented systematic abuse of power. The case study revealed how corruption thrived when good people remained silent, while evil flourished in positions of authority. Students learned to recognize early warning signs of judicial misconduct and understood their professional obligations to report unethical behavior, regardless of personal consequences. Ernest Williams had returned to his position at the courthouse, but now served as Director of Judicial Integrity, a new position created to monitor courtroom procedures and provide confidential reporting channels for staff who witnessed misconduct. His transformation from invisible janitor to integrity guardian inspired similar programs nationwide. Williams's office investigated complaints about judicial behavior while providing protection for whistleblowers who risked retaliation for reporting misconduct. The program had prevented 3 potential corruption schemes during its first year of operation, demonstrating the value of empowering ordinary courthouse employees to serve as guardians of justice. The federal prosecutions resulting from David's case had concluded with comprehensive convictions. Judge Crawford received a 25-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, bribery, and conspiracy. His appeals had been exhausted, and he remained imprisoned at a federal facility where his former authority meant nothing. Robert Sterling was sentenced to 18 years for racketeering and bribery, with his development empire liquidated to pay restitution to victims of his corruption schemes. The properties built through corrupt approvals were sold, with proceeds funding legal aid programs and judicial reform initiatives. Mayor Preston received a lighter sentence of 8 years after cooperating with federal investigators and providing evidence against other participants in the conspiracy. His political career ended in disgrace, but his cooperation helped prosecutors understand the full scope of corruption throughout county government. The institutional changes implemented after the case had transformed how justice operated in Riverside County. All court proceedings were now recorded and live-streamed, providing transparency that prevented judicial misconduct while educating citizens about legal processes. Judicial assignment procedures had been reformed to prevent manipulation of case assignments for corrupt purposes. Computer algorithms now randomly assigned cases to available judges, eliminating opportunities for interested parties to ensure favorable judicial treatment. New ethics training requirements mandated annual education for all courthouse personnel, from judges to janitors, emphasizing everyone's role in maintaining judicial integrity. The programs used David's case as an example of how ordinary individuals could become heroes by refusing to enable corruption. Police Chief Williams had implemented comprehensive reforms within his department, creating citizen oversight committees and mandatory reporting procedures for officers who witness misconduct. The department's relationship with the district attorney's office had been rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The media attention surrounding the case had attracted national interest in judicial reform. Documentary filmmakers, investigative journalists, and academic researchers had produced extensive examinations of how corruption could infiltrate legal systems and the importance of institutional safeguards. Amanda Foster had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the Crawford conspiracy, but she continued covering local government as a reminder that vigilant journalism was essential for democratic accountability. Her work inspired other reporters to scrutinize judicial behavior and government corruption. Foster's reporting had revealed that similar corruption patterns existed in other jurisdictions, leading to federal investigations in 3 additional counties. The ripple effects of David's case had exposed systematic problems requiring nationwide attention and reform. David's reputation had been not only restored but enhanced by his experience. He received speaking invitations from bar associations, law schools, and government organizations seeking to understand how individual integrity could overcome institutional corruption. During these presentations, David emphasized that his case demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of democratic institutions. Systems designed to protect justice could be subverted by determined bad actors, but they could also be restored by individuals willing to fight for what was right. The State Bar Association had established the David Washington Award for Prosecutorial Courage, recognizing prosecutors who demonstrated integrity under extreme pressure. The annual award kept David's story alive while inspiring other legal professionals to maintain ethical standards despite personal costs. Recipients of the award represented diverse backgrounds and circumstances, but all had chosen principle over personal safety when facing corruption or intimidation. Their stories built on David's legacy while demonstrating that courage remained essential for preserving justice. Rebecca's medical career had also flourished following the case's resolution. Her experience supporting David through his ordeal had inspired her to advocate for healthcare workers facing workplace retaliation for reporting safety violations or unethical practices. She had established a support network for medical professionals dealing with institutional pressure to compromise patient care or safety standards. The program provided legal resources, emotional support, and career protection for healthcare workers who prioritized patient welfare over institutional interests. The Washington family's experience had become a symbol of resilience and integrity for families facing similar challenges. Rebecca and David frequently counseled other couples dealing with professional retaliation or personal attacks resulting from ethical stands. Jasmine's college applications had attracted attention from prestigious universities impressed by her family's commitment to justice and her own advocacy work. She had organized high school student groups focused on civic engagement and government accountability. Her generation of students had grown up understanding that democracy required active participation and constant vigilance. The lessons learned from her father's experience shaped her perspective on civic responsibility and individual agency in promoting systemic change. The courthouse where David had faced his greatest professional challenge now displayed portraits of integrity heroes, including Ernest Williams and other individuals who had risked everything to preserve justice. The gallery served as daily inspiration for legal professionals and reminded visitors that ordinary people could become extraordinary defenders of justice.
Judge Crawford's former courtroom had been converted into a training facility for judicial ethics education. The space where corruption had once flourished now served to educate future judges about their responsibilities and the consequences of betraying public trust. David often reflected on the case's broader implications during quiet moments in his office. The conspiracy had revealed how quickly democratic institutions could be corrupted when citizens became complacent or good people remained silent in the face of obvious wrongdoing. Yet the case had also demonstrated that truth possessed inherent power that eventually overcame even sophisticated efforts to suppress it. The courage of individuals like Ernest Williams proved that ordinary people could preserve extraordinary institutions when they chose principle over personal safety. The lasting legacy of David's ordeal was the understanding that justice remained fragile and required constant protection from those who would exploit it for personal gain. But the case also proved that when good people refused to surrender, justice could prevail against even the most determined corruption. Future generations would study the Crawford conspiracy as a reminder that democracy's survival depended not on perfect institutions, but on imperfect people making moral choices when faced with the opportunity to do right or remain silent. David's story had become more than personal vindication. It was a testament to the power of individual integrity to preserve collective justice for generations yet to come.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.